Here we go. All right, so welcome everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen with you. We'll get the big image up here. All right. All right, so here we go. Welcome to the Science of Armadillos. Like I mentioned, if you haven't been here before, I encourage everyone to ask questions and have comments. Go ahead and put them in the chat. There are little stopping points, but mostly what usually happens is we get to the very end and we have like a question and answer session. So please ask questions, have comments, just make sure that they're related to the topic on hand and that we are kind to everyone that's on the video with us today. Otherwise, we do have that right to remove you from the webinar. I also want to point out that I am not an armadillo expert. I have not been studying them for 50 plus years. I'm sure there's still things that I have yet to learn about them. I love science and I'm a science communicator. So that is my background and I'm an expert in that. So if I can't find the answer to something, or if you ask me a question and I don't know, which could possibly happen, I will definitely find the answer for you and get back to you. So please ask questions, even though I'm not an armadillo expert by any means. All right, so let's go ahead and get going here. Let's start rolling. Aha, like armadillos. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit first about kind of how armadillos came to be and their evolutionary history and their literacy history and kind of just like how they started coming up in the world. So like all animals and other people and things, there's a lot of these creatures in myths and stories. They date all the way back to Maya legends. The first kind of mention of armadillos, it was told that Hayechicum was the Maya sun god, and basically he sat down two of these what were called disobedient gods on this bench, and he needed to teach them a lesson. So basically he transformed this bench into an armadillo, and both of these gods that needed to be taught a lesson fell backwards, and they everyone was laughing at them and they were in disgrace. So we needed to teach them a lesson, but the bench turned into an armadillo, and that was kind of the first record of the armadillos kind of being brought out into history. If you're familiar with the British author Rudyard Kipling, which many of you might be, he also mentioned armadillos in a little bit different light. He had a series called this Just So Stories, and it was for children. And basically, he kind of gathered armadillos as this alliance between a hedgehog and a turtle. Very different creatures than an armadillo, and they're definitely not the compilings of a turtle and a hedgehog. But basically, he explained this story, this kind of funny, humorous story about this jaguar and this turtle taught how to be less prickly and then more armored instead. And so the hedgehog then taught the turtle how to curl up into a protective ball. And basically the very end of this was that two armadillos confused this hungry jaguar that was trying to eat them. So they both taught each other a lesson, and they were an alliance together, a turtle and a hedgehog. So they are not turtles, they are not hedgehogs, they are very different animals. So, but those are kind of just the myths and the stories that I found that were interesting as far as the armadillos go. As far as their actual evolutionary history, long time ago, this goes all the way back to the Paleocene epoch, which was 65 to about 50 million years ago. These animals are called xenarthrans. So they are related to things like sloths and anteaters. And basically, this is kind of where the lineage of those armadillos began. So these early ancestors of our modern day armadillos, they were small, they were mammal-like creatures, and they lived in what is now South America. If you fast forward to 50 to 30 million years ago, they started to develop the characteristics that we kind of see in our modern day species, but they're a little less. So they started to get that bony armor on them, although it wasn't as much as what we see today. But fossils from this period show these very primitive armadillos, but they had a little less developed armor than the ones that we see today in modern times. When fast forward a little more, we got 23 to 5 million years ago. This is where that lineage really diversified very significantly. So During this time, they started to get different body sizes and different shapes and armor types, and they started to fulfill different ecological niches within the environment. The fossil records from this time indicate that some species grew very large and some species kind of retained the small stature. If you've ever heard of a glyptodont, which was very related to a modern day armadillo, you can see them actually at Morrill Hall. If you've ever been to Morrill Hall here in Nebraska, you can see a example of them, but basically it resembled this giant armadillo. We'll talk about them here in a little bit, but this giant 2-ton armadillo versus these very, very small armadillos. Today we have, not Nebraska, but there's a fairy armadillo, and they're very, very little. So very large lineage right here that really started to diversify as far as species goes. And then this also came the rise of what's called the nine-banded armadillo, which is kind of what we're going to center around today, because that is the species that we see when we do see them here in Nebraska. This is what we see. So they have very specific characteristics. They began to evolve during this time, kind of in the late Miocene to the early Pliocene area. And then adaptations included its very unique 9-banded armor and a very specific diet that focused on things like insects and small invertebrates. All right, so 9-banded armadillo about 2.6 million to 11,700 years ago. Our climate in our world really started to shift, and a lot of different animals could not survive. And so we saw a very large die out of a lot of the species that were there during that time. But somehow this armadillo, this adaptability of the species and their diet and their habitat really allowed it to thrive when a lot of other species went extinct. And then recent history and kind of that northward expansion that we were talking about, following the last ice age that we had, the 9-banded armadillo kind of began expanding its range northward. Scientists kind of assume that this is probably because of humans and human-related activities, but about the 19th and 20th centuries, they really started migrating into southern United States, most likely the reason because of human alteration of the landscape. So also with our climate shifting, it's getting significantly warmer. We all mostly know that. We're also starting to see these creatures more and more shift north into Nebraska, and Nebraska being one of those places where we see them almost quite frequently now. All right, I wanted to touch really quick on this glyptodont. These guys are so cool, and I'll show you a picture here in a minute, but they are these giant armored animals. They were basically this ball of armor, and they're encased in it from head to tail, and it's extremely thick. They have this protective armor on them. They lived kind of about 5.3 million to about 11,700 years ago, and they have very similar armor to the modern day armadillos. Their shell was around 5 feet long. They weighed about 2 tons. That's about the size of a truck. Tail had armor and even acted like almost a lethal club if they needed to swing it to a predator. And it ate a lot of things like plants, carrion, or dead animals, and even insects at the time. And here's what one kind of looks like. So they're very interesting animals. If you've seen the movie Ice Age, the kind of comedy, the Ice Age movie, you've seen one of these before in there. They're very slow moving and they move like an armadillo. It almost looks like they're on little roller skates. So very cool animals, but these are related to the modern day armadillos that we see now. All right, so now that we kind of know a little bit of history of these animals, let's go ahead and move into their physical characteristics and some of those really neat adaptations that they have. All right, so like I mentioned, there's about 20 species of armadillos in the world. We're going to focus on the one that we see here in Nebraska because that's where I'm joining you from today is Nebraska. So the 9-banded armadillo is kind of the one that we're going to focus all of our efforts around today. But these are what we call New World placental mammals. So very similar to that of like a coyote, a mountain lion, any of those things, they have a placenta when they give birth, very similar to a human. So we call them placental mammals. If you think of something more related to like a possum. That is a marsupial, so a little bit different, and even have monotremes. So there's lots of different types of mammals. So a lot of people think they are marsupials. They're actually placental mammals. So when you look at their reproductive strategy, it's no different than that of like a coyote. So 20 species total in the world, all except for one live in Latin America. That's that northern nine-banded armadillo. The only living mammal that has a shell like this. So when we talk about a turtle, it's kind of similar, but they're not mammals, right? They're reptiles or chelonians, whatever you want to call them. But these guys have this very, very unique shell, this body armor that they have. We talked earlier that there's anarthrans, so they're related to things like sloths and anteaters. They have similar characteristics, even though they look completely different. And then contrary to popular belief, not all armadillos are able to encase themselves in their shell. There's only one that actually can, like a complete ball, and that's the three-banded armadillo. So we don't have that here in Nebraska. We have the nine-banded. They can kind of get together in a little, they can hunch over, but they cannot encase themselves in like a true ball and enclose themselves in it. So, but the nine-banded armadillo is the only species that includes the United States in its range. All right, so what in the world are these things? I think I missed one. All right. Sorry. All right. So what in the world are these things? So like no other armadillos, the nine-banded armadillos have this outer body that's covered in this really kind of a leathery keratinous skin. So keratin is the same protein that your fingernails, your hair, if you look on like a raptor, like a bird, a eagle, or a red-tailed hawk, they're going to be the same type of material that's made out of their claws or their talons, people call them. So it's that keratin. So these guys are really neat. They also have scales. So true scales are, they're going to be a little different than that of a reptile, but they're known as osteoderm, so more bone-like scales. And they're typically a rectangular or a pentagonal pattern in shape, and they develop later with the rest of the skeleton. So when young armadillos are born, they do have these, but they're not as hard. It hardens as they get older. When we talk about their armor, it comprises about 16% of their total body weight, which doesn't seem like a lot, considering how much of it their body covers. And when we talk about their armor, it's divided into three main areas of the body. There's something called the pelvic shield. So your pelvis is kind of down by where your hip joints are, the shield on the shoulder region, and then the characteristic bands that are on the back. So this animal has the nine-banded armadillo, but technically it could have anywhere from 8 to 11 bands. There's always exceptions in the animal world. So just like I talked about, they have 9 visible bands, even though sometimes it can vary from 8 to 11. And then each band is separated by a very thin epidermal layer of skin and hair. So as you can see in this photo, it almost looks like perfect little lines running down the back. Those are the bands that we call. And there's also that little, it looks like a crack in between them. So that's that very thin epidermal layer of skin and the hair that's inside of it. So the scales will grow continuously through the life of the animal, and they are never fully shed. So in a snake or even a turtle, pieces of the shed and the scales will come off. That is not true for these guys. They wear, but they never fully shed off of the animal. And then the head is partially covered in this bony keratinous scale. It's a little different. It's not like the rest of the body. And then the underside of it has no armor protection, and it's a lot paler in color. And then also when you look at it, their snout is a little softer. It doesn't have that bony keratinous plates on it either. It's pink in colored, and it almost looks like a tapered shape, and it looks more like a pig. This is to help from them with digging. And then their face, neck, and their underside all have these little clusters of small hairs that you will see. All right, so they have short legs, 4 toes on the front, 5 toes on the back, and their skull is very unique. It is what we call dorsoventrally flattened. So it looks like someone took a skull and then like Play-Doh went like this and squished it, so it looks more elongated than a normal skull. It's very flattened, and if you ever find an armadillo skull, you will know right away because it looks like nothing else you're going to find in Nebraska. And it also has these weird V-shaped teeth, and they're all basically the same. They're very uniform compared to like our teeth, for instance, how we have molars and premolars and canines and incisors, so very different shapes. These guys kind of have all one shape of their teeth, and then they also range from 28 to 32 teeth in total, and they have long sticky tongues. Their teeth also lack enamel, and they grow throughout the animal's lifetime, which is different than a lot of other mammals. Hopefully you can see this, and I know it's kind of hard, but here's what the skull of a armadillo looks like, a nine-banded armadillo. You can see it's very flat. They have this like almost shield-like protection. It looks like a hat that they're wearing, and it actually is separated from the rest of the skull. And then I know it's hard to see, but their teeth are very peg-like, and they look like a V shape, and they're all the same. There's no incisors, there's no molars. They're all very different, or all very the same from each other. All right. One of the things I also forgot to mention too is that these guys, these guys have really very flexible in their habitat. So thinking about when they look like this, it looks like they could only live in certain areas, but they're actually very flexible when we talk about their types of habitats that they live in. All right, so armadillos, a little bit about kind of what they eat. Their behaviors is really interesting. And again, some of those really cool adaptations that we're going to hit on as well. All right, so their range, like I mentioned, these are the only species of armadillos that extends into the United States. Otherwise, they all mostly live in that Latin America kind of area. But all the way you can find them from Argentina, Mexico, Central America. So they have a very wide range, these species. And clearly, they're doing just fine in those areas that they've able to expand northward. And we know our climate is very different from that of Mexico and Argentina. So when we see armadillos in Nebraska, especially if they've been here during the winter, they do not have scales or that armor on their ears. They're very open. They have very little hair on their ears. So what happens, we see a lot of them have frostbite. So they are able to withstand these cold temperatures for short periods of time. They burrow in, they stay there for a while. But oftentimes we will see some that have frostbite on their ears, and we know then that they've at least been here through one winter. But they're still here. They didn't retreat back somewhere else. So they're pretty hardy, adaptable, resilient animals. It's the only species native to the United States. They've been expanding their range for about a century or so. Right now, you can find them in places like Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Louisiana, Missouri, and also Nebraska. But like I mentioned, they are not one of our native animals. They have kind of moved here because of human alterations and also because of climate. But their range, scientists are kind of guessing and predicting that their range could reach all the way to Massachusetts. So that's pretty far north. But mostly their distribution is dependent on those soil conditions. So we'll talk about this in a little bit later, but they're very good diggers and burrowers, and they need to be able to dig somewhere where the soil isn't too hard. So it's not necessarily that they don't want to go to Kentucky, but Kentucky might not have the right soil conditions. So their range is solely dependent on that soil type. But again, they're adaptable to many different habitats. There's grasslands, scrublands, forests, wetlands, salt marshes. As long as they have enough food and water and they have the right soil conditions to dig their burrows, they're going to be just fine. There's a lot of people that also find them in like human-made areas, cemeteries, golf courses, parks. A lot of people kind of, again, they kind of get that nuisance or pest species label because they can be adaptable and found in those human-made places, not necessarily where people want them all the time. All right, so their food habits, they pretty much eat anything. They're generalist and they're opportunistic. So whatever they can really find, they'll try and eat it. They're not super picky. But looking at some studies, they found that about 500 separate food items make up their diet. So that means that they've tried 500 different food items that they could and would eat if they are eating something. About 90% of their diet is made up of animal matter. So that's going to be things like bugs, millipedes, centipedes, ants, grasshoppers, earthworms, other insects, those kind of things. Even things like adult and larval beetles that kind of make up the largest portion of that 90% diet of animal matter. And then less than 10% of their diet is made up of plant material. So A lot of the times, people will see them eating fungi. They will see them eating some berries, but again, 90% of their meal is animal matter. And then they rely mostly on their sense of smell for foraging. They have very bad eyesight. They don't hear very well. They have basically really bad senses except for their smell. So their smell is how they forage and how they smell and find things. And then basically what they will do to find their food is they will often visit very shallow burrows in search of invertebrates that have become trapped, and that's a very easy meal for them. So even though they are good predators, everything gets eaten eventually. So even nine-banded armadillos with their natural body armor on them, they have predation as well. So nine-banded armadillos actually have quite a few natural predators. The younger juveniles have way higher predation than the adults, just because one, they're smaller, they're weaker, but also their armor is not quite fully developed yet. So these guys have, natural predators like coyotes, mountain lions, black bears, wolves, even in areas that are like south, it could be jaguars, alligators, bobcats, large raptors, but mostly they prey on younger armadillos or those juveniles because their armor is not as tough, and also they are smaller as well. All right. Many scientists believe that the decline of many of those natural predator populations in North America, for many reasons, has actually aided in the response of that rapid northern expansion of those species. So less predators out there means more juvenile armadillos survive to adulthood, which means more produce, and there's more of them out there. So a lot of scientists are kind of linking those two things together. So it's not necessarily a horrible thing, but we all know that there's those checks and balances in the ecosystem. So having too many armadillos could do these bad things, and having predators to eat those animals is something that's just in that checks and balances. And then despite their appearance and how they move, they kind of lumber around. They actually can run about 30 miles an hour, which is insane to me, 30 miles an hour for those little guys, which is kind of interesting as well. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about their behavior, because I think that is kind of one of the most interesting things. We'll talk more about their burrowing as well. All right, so these guys, most of the time, they're going to be nocturnal, so they'll come out at nighttime, or they're going to be crepuscular, which means they are most active during the early morning hours or the kind of the late evening hours, so dawn and dusk. But they mostly forage in the day during the cold or the cloudy periods. Just like most other animals, they don't like super hot and they don't like super cold. They like that kind of Goldilocks, just right version. These animals also do not hibernate. So evolutionarily, coming from a very warm climate, they never needed to hibernate. So they don't know how to do it when they come up to the northward areas. Many of our animals don't necessarily hibernate in Nebraska. There's very few animals that truly hibernate, but there are a lot of animals that like estivate or they do torpor. They sleep for short periods of time when the weather is very bad. These guys hunker down for a while. But again, we'll see a lot of them actually we will see in Nebraska that have frostbitten ears or frostbitten paws. Just another one of those things that happens when animals just really aren't built for this climate, but they're trying to survive here anyway. And then also, one of the things that they can do is they can cross streams and rivers by swimming, or even if the river or stream is shallow enough, they'll just walk on the bottom. They can hold a lot of oxygen in their body, and they can hold their breath for about 6 minutes, which is pretty impressive. And these guys also, but they tire quickly. That's the only thing. And they cannot cross very wide bodies of water. They are good swimmers, but if they try to cross like the Missouri River with a very strong current, probably could not do that. But a small stream or even a lake that's pretty shallow where they can walk would not be that big of a deal. Something else I forgot to mention as far as like the predation goes, when they're scared or when they're surprised, they just jump straight up. If you've ever seen an armadillo do this, there's really cool YouTube videos that people are kind of walking around with their cameras and all of a sudden they come across an armadillo, and armadillos are kind of like skunks to me, like they're very unaware of what's happening around them. So when they become scared, you just go, wheep, and you just see them like jump right up in the air, just straight up in the air. It's kind of a funny video. They just hop up like a little video game character. So if you ever get a chance, look at that on YouTube. I'll try to find a really good video and put that in the link as well when I send out your registration information too. All right, so let's talk a little bit about digging and burrowing. So these animals, they're built for digging. So if you remember the skull that I showed you, it's very flattened, and it looks like a torpedo shape. That's perfect for digging. So they can get their snout in to find their food, but they can also bury themselves as well. So these animals, they are very widespread burrowing species. They dig numerous large burrows within their home ranges. These burrows then are likely used by other wildlife species. So we know that prairie dogs are a keystone species, which simply means that their burrows help other animals as well. There was a study done in Arkansas. I'm not going to say that armadillos are keystone species, but there's definitely evidence that their burrows help aid other animals as well. So the study done in Arkansas showed that they put game camera trails up and they were trying to find out which other animals use armadillo burrows. And so they were looking within this small little area of Arkansas. And within this time frame of a summer, they found that 19 species of mammals, 4 species of reptile, 1 species of amphibian, and over 40 species of birds somehow interacted with the burrows. If that could mean that they found food in the burrows, that could mean that they used a burrow that was abandoned. They somehow interacted with those burrows. So it's really showing that they are using those burrows more than just one time, and lots of other animals are doing it. In the South, there's places that are familiar if you have ever seen a gopher or a desert tortoise. For instance, like Florida is a place where you can find desert and gopher tortoises. They are one of those species that's kind of threatened. They're not doing extremely well. Scientists kind of believe that they are using armadillo burrows to help kind of ramp up their population. So the more safety that they have, the more burrows that they can use, those are one of the ways that we can kind of build and monitor that species. And one of the ways that they found that they're using them is through those gopher and tortoises are using those burrows. And then also things like black-tailed prairie dogs. So instead of digging a whole new hole, they're using these abandoned armadillo burrows as well. All right, so what's a burrow look like? It kind of depends. There's a lot of averages that I found with on these, but overall, they look like it's approximately about 20 centimeters wide, 15 centimeters high, and on average about 50 centimeters deep. However, there have been a few studies done, and there was one that was found that was 4.5 meters deep. So that's quite deep compared to the 50 centimeters. They will excavate their own burrows most of the time. They disperse the soil at the front of the burrow, and they create something called an apron. So if you've ever had moles in your yard or groundhogs, when you dig up something, they kind of disperse this apron-looking fan that comes out of a hole. That is one way to know that you have a digging animal. So like a mole or actually moles won't do that. They will tunnel underneath, but things like a groundhog or things like a 13-line ground squirrel or an armadillo, they will have those kind of mounds of aprons, was what they call them. The entrances include mounded soil, there's leaf litter, or sometimes you'll see exposed ground. They will use their noses and their front feet to loosen the soil, and then they will pull it back until they are underground. And then basically they use their hind limbs to kick the soil away. So it's almost like a conveyor belt. Front limbs move it out, back limbs move it completely out of the way. And then they mostly prefer to dig in those moist soils near water. So again, even though they can move into other places, they need specific soil composition to be able to build their burrows. All right, so we talked about they do excavate their own burrows, but there are some lazy armadillos out there and they don't. But also thinking about it, work smarter, not harder. So not all armadillos will dig their own burrows. Some of them will use ones that are abandoned, but they can feed on the roots. And so oftentimes the burrows were built near food sources. Again, working smarter, not harder. A lot of them will also construct above ground shelters using dried grass. So not necessarily a burrow, but a shelter above the ground in dried grass that covers them so they can aid in that protection as well. And then the soil, like we talked about, plays a large part in the number of armadillo burrows that they will make. Oftentimes, they will construct anywhere from 5 to 10 burrows within their territory. So underneath, all of these burrows are connected by tunnel systems, and oftentimes they only have one entrance, so they know where it is, what's happening, and who's going in and out of those burrows. In Georgia, there was a study done on armadillo burrows. The average number of burrows that each armadillo had within its home range was 11. So either there was really good soil in Georgia, not very many armadillos, or their home ranges were bigger, but they had on average 11 different burrows within their home range. All right, so why do they need to dig a burrow? Well, they provide many purposes for these animals. It's safety from their predators. It's a space to raise their young. During really harsh weather, it's just somewhere where they can go. During the summer, armadillos will spend about 29% of their day underground, and they will only emerge at night when it's cooler to feed. And then in the winter, about 65% of their time is spent in their burrows, and then they will emerge during the warmest part of the day to feed as well. Again, they do not hibernate, so they will spend more time in those burrows during the colder times of the year. The young will remain in the burrow for about 2 to 3 weeks before emerging to establish their own territory. So it's not very long for young armadillos. All right, so speaking of young armadillos, their reproduction. So during the summer breeding season, usually about June and July, armadillos will often be seen pairing up. So these are very solitary animals. So if you see 2 armadillos together, that's weird. We know something's going on. It's probably mating season. During the pairing, the male remains a few meters away, kind of casually looking over the female, and they will occasionally forage together if the female deems that that's okay. They will also do sometimes dorsal touches. They'll do tail wagging. Sometimes the female will lift her tail, which exposes her genitalia, showing the male that she could be ready to mate. And then also there's a lot of smelling going on. So these animals have very poor eyesight. They don't have great taste. They don't have good sight. So smell is a huge way for them to communicate with each other. And then some males have even been seen sharing a burrow with a female. That's rare, but it does happen. And then males are also really close to the female, so they can kind of claim and protect her from other males. Usually only males that have an extensive home range usually pair. Ones that they don't really have a lot to offer the female, so they don't even try mating, because other males that have more space are going to have kind of the first dibs on the female. So mating system, what's it look like? Females have a very large external clitoris. The males don't, they lack an external scrotum, and their testes are internal. And then during conception, there's only a single ovum is fertilized. And so basically that blastocyst will stay in the uterus for about 14 weeks before it implants. So that's usually about once in early summer are they ready to mate. And then when that blastocyst finally implants, it buds into 4 identical embryos, and then every embryo will have its own amniotic cavity, and this always results in the process of 4 identical quadruplets. So that's one of the really neat things about armadillos, is that when we see mammals, 1, maybe 2, 3 is like super rare. These animals, 4 quadruplets is the norm. If you have any less or any more, that is rare, but identical quadruplets of 4 is really interesting. So these quadruplets, they're born most of the time in early spring. They have about a 4-month gestation period inside of the mom. They do have delayed implantation. So the female will mate, and then that blastocyst will not implant for a while. So basically that's evolution over time has known that when then they finally do implant, and those juveniles that are born, they are born in a time when the best conditions are available for them to survive. So when they're born in what we call an advanced state of development. They come out looking very similar to the mom. With human babies, they do not. They are not able to obviously be by themselves. They grow. They often don't see very well. So there's a lot of differences between those certain types of mammals. So baby armadillos look very very close to the mom. They're very small and sized. They also open their eyes quickly, and they do have that kind of leathery skin, but it does not harden for a few weeks. The young of both sexes then can start breeding as early as the summer following their birth, but they may not reach sexual maturity until they're about 2 years old. So armadillos, I guess we'll talk about their longevity right here. They range from about 7 to 8 years old, sometimes 20 years old. Even I saw 23 was like the highest that they've ever lived, but that was also in captivity. Juveniles, like we talked about earlier, have a way higher mortality rate than adults. There's a lot of things that influence their longevity: climate, predation, disease. The species does not do extremely well in cold weather. If we've kind of been paying attention to Nebraska's weather, we've had there's a big shift in the amount of cold days under a certain temperature. I think a lot of us have noticed this in Nebraska. We have some very cold days, do not get me wrong, but we have less of those very cold days. So that at one point we think was keeping armadillos away, but since our climate is shifting to be warmer, we're noticing now that those animals are kind of dealing with it a little bit more. But that doesn't mean that there's not mortality as well. So they don't do well because they also have a very small amount of body hair. Animals like a fox would do a lot better in cold areas compared to an armadillo. Another thing that really influenced their longevity and their lifespan, I'm sure a lot of us have seen an armadillo roadkill before. Road mortality is a huge factor as well. The first armadillo I ever saw was on the road. I thought it was a shoe on the road. I'm like, what is that? And someone's like, it's an armadillo. We see them all the time. And then once you kind of notice, you do see them all the time. When you drive to like St. Louis, for instance, they're all over the roads as mortality. So it's a big deal when we see them on the roads because so many of them get hit. All right, something else that there's a lot of kind of miscommunication about. We talked about disease could be a factor that kind of influences their longevity or how long they live. One of the things that's kind of been going around for a long time is this idea that armadillos carry leprosy. And it's sort of true. So they are a natural host for this bacterium, which causes leprosy, also known as Hansen's disease. We often believe that they can contaminate the soil, the bacteria through burrowing and their defecation. If humans were to get in contact with that, we could potentially transmit that disease over to us. That could infect humans through the soil. Most likely what's happening though is that it's when people, as long as you don't handle them, if you don't need to handle them, don't handle them and don't eat them is basically what scientists are telling people. But a lot of scientists actually believe that humans were the ones that gave, long time ago, humans gave this disease to armadillos, and now basically they're giving it back to us. Likely reason, so the leprosy disease, this bacterium, is basically a wimp. It needs a very, very certain body temperature to thrive in an animal. We talked about that Goldilocks symptom, not too hot, not too cold. This is basically just a perfect way, their body temperature. Scientists believe that they can hold it in their body very well. So it's likely the reason their body temperature and then this very fragile nature of this disease. Just to give you an idea where this has happened, but this zoonotic transmission, so we saw this a lot with the COVID ideas as well, is that an animal can give people a disease and when it jumps species. So transmissions of leprosy have been recorded in places like Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. So it has transed or jumped to people, but scientists call leprosy, quote, a wimp of a pathogen. It dies very quickly outside of the body, and it needs a specific 90-degree temperature to survive. Armadillos just happen to be that perfect temperature, and it's something that they have had and they are a natural host for quite some time. But again, as long as you don't overly handle or just handle them, period, or eat the animal, that transmission can't really occur. So basically, how common are we talking about? So worldwide, not just in the United States, but worldwide, about 250,000 people are transmitted leprosy every single year. So out of the 8 billion people on our planet, 250,000 of them will get this disease. So the risk of transmission to humans is quite low. In America, it's only about 100 to 250 people that are affected each year. And then if this makes you feel any better, 95% of the population is genetically unsusceptible to contracting it. So even if you eat an armadillo, if you handle an armadillo, you touch an armadillo, it doesn't mean that you're going to get leprosy. 95% of people we can't get it. So that 250,000 people in the world, they're one of those 5% of people that don't have the gene where they're unsusceptible. So they are susceptible to that gene. And then today, even if you do get leprosy, it's highly treatable and it's actually not as contagious as people once believed. There in like the 50s and 60s, people like freaked out about it. There's just a lot that we didn't know at the time, but now we know that it's just not as contagious as we once thought. Scientists also, like I mentioned earlier, believe that humans were actually the ones that transferred the leprosy to them about 400 to 500 years ago. And with all the populations that they have tested, only about 20% of some armadillo populations are thought to be infected. Animals like this, they rarely live long enough to be seriously affected by the disease, and therefore then they can't transfer it. So their longevity, their temperature, human handling, it can all basically be avoided. All right, and then really quickly, just a little about their communication and their perception. So we talked earlier about how important their smell was for mating, for finding food. So olfaction, or that smelling capability, is the primary communication mode for these animals. They travel with their nose basically to the ground. They're looking and smelling invertebrates. They can smell about 20 centimeters below the surface to find those invertebrates. Also, something that's neat is they can stand bipedally. So they can stand on their two back legs, and you kind of look at them when they're walking around. They're smelling. So they're lifting their nose in the air to find some food or find a mate. When they do that, they brace themselves with their tail, and then they sniff the air to locate their food. They do have a good sense of hearing, but not as great as other animals. It is used to avoid predation, but they do have a very poor sense of vision, and also basically it's useless at close distances. They just don't see well. Maybe that's why they get hit by cars so much. And then also they have a poor sense of touch. When looked at their taste buds, they have fewer taste buds than most other mammals. So scientists believe that likely they have a very poor sense of taste as well, which might be why they eat so many different types of things. So not the best sensors, but I guess you have good hearing and good smell. That's something that can help you. All right, so that was about it. Usually Science Of don't usually go about an hour, just that's a long time for people to sit. And so about 45 minutes is our time that we usually do. Here, just telling you, if you're interested, if you're just like, whoa, I really like armadillos, I didn't know this was a whole series. So we will do this for the next 6 weeks. I guess 7, because there will be none on July 4th. We'll be celebrating a holiday then. But next week, we will talk about tiger beetles. So it'll be the same time every week, 3 to 4 p.m. Central Standard Time via Zoom. And each event will have its own registration link. So make sure that you register for the correct one. We're going to be talking about slime molds, milkweed, the sandhills, and then we're going to finish off this summer series with everyone's favorite animal in the world, which is ticks. All right. And then if you really liked this and you want more information, we have done a ton of Science Ofs. Last thing I think I looked, there were 75 videos up there. So if you're like, wow, it'd be really interesting if she did a Science Of corvids, like the blue jays and the crows, well, you're in luck. We have done one. So there's a lot of different themes and topics that you can watch. So please go ahead and check out Nebraska Education YouTube channel. There's also lots of other things on there as well. There's a Wildlife Education Facebook and Instagram page for events and kind of just some fun facts. And then we do have our Wildlife Education website as well that has free downloadable PowerPoints, information, scavenger hunts, lots of things. All right, so that's not all that I have for you, but let's go ahead and check the chat just to see if we have any questions or comments. And then otherwise, we'll see all of you next week. One of the things I do want to reiterate is that I will send everyone, regardless of whether you were here to watch the whole thing or not, everyone that registered, I will send you the link with this on the YouTube channel. I will send you some information with some more links in it. I'll try to find a really cool video of the armadillos kind of jumping up. So just some extra things and resources for all of you. So, all right. It looks like there's no questions, which is good. Either I answered everything or I completely overwhelmed you. So one of the two. Oh, okay. Good question. Are armadillos aggressive if we see one in a field? Good question, Dwayne. Most of the time, if you see an armadillo, it probably won't even know you're there. It will smell you, but it won't see you. I've heard a lot of people say that when they're in the field, they can come up on an armadillo right away and it will like just jump up in the air and then scurry away. Most of the time it smells you beforehand. It will try to avoid you just like most other animals. So good question. It's definitely not anything that you need to be concerned about or anything, but yeah, good question. Since the babies are all identical, I assume it's a litter of either 4 males or 4 females. Ooh, good. I didn't get that far as far as their gender goes. I just know that they are identical quadruplets. So that would be something that I can look up and send to the group. I'm sure most of you are already Googling it right now, so you'll probably find the answer faster than I will. But yes, as far as I know, it's just identical quadruplets. So with that, I would be interested to know what people find. Otherwise, I can certainly do some digging as well. All right. Unless there's more questions that come up, I will hopefully see all of you next week. We're going to be talking about tiger beetles. I'm going to try to bring in some really cool like show and tell things on Zoom. We have someone here in the office that's raising tiger beetles. So I would like to show some cool things if I can. So make sure you come back next week for that. There is that separate Zoom link, so make sure you register and hopefully we will see all of you next week or different parts of the week for the summer. So thank you everyone for watching. Go outside and enjoy the day and we will see you next week. Thanks, everyone.